adjusting to life in this village of Velarde in New Mexico in the Espanola Valley, which, if you're driving between Santa Fe and Taos, if you're driving from Santa Fe up to Taos to visit Taos Pueblo or to see the turtle dance Thursday at San Juan Pueblo, now known as Okeowinga Pueblo. The Pueblo switched back to the Tewa language name just while we were living there, as a matter of fact, which kind of bears out the fact that the conquest and the resistance to it is still very much ongoing in northern New Mexico and in many other places. If you're going on the road from Santa Fe to Taos, you're going to go right through Velarde, and you're not going to see it. The highway is set above the village just a little bit. You'll catch maybe a couple of tin rooftops of the adobes, and if you do, you'll think a quaint northern New Mexican adobe village, the very picture of New Mexican pastoral. You know, you render it in a plein air painting, and it would look beautiful, because it is beautiful. Desert America argues that tourism, and real estate speculation, and artistic representation have come together in a rather unholy alliance that began while the conquest, our American Manifest Destiny conquest of the Southwest, was still occurring. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe railroads, a railroad that went through New Mexico, needed paying customers. How did we get paying customers on the ATSF? The ATSF hired the greatest painters of the day. Blumenschein, Moran, the founders of the Taos Art Colony, ultimately. The canvases that these amazing painters rendered ended up reproduced in train stations, in McClure's and Harper's. These beautiful landscapes, which almost always were bereft of human figures. It was just the natural landscape. And if there was a human figure on it, it was a winsome native figure. Hispanos rarely made artistic representation back then. The figures completely collapsed the history of conquest and made it a place that just seemed, well, enchanted. The irony is that most of the painters of the Santa Fe and Taos art colonies would have considered themselves, and in the context of their time and place, were in liberal, progressive, or even radical circles. They were hanging out with people like Mary Austin, right? But the residue of the gaze of conquest worked its way into their work. You can read it in D.H. Lawrence. You can read it in Mabel Dodge Lujan. These works, these artistic works, in literature and in painting and in film, the Western, still animate that landscape for us and hide what's behind that scrim. In the most recent boom and bust cycle, many of the old Western tropes, Old West, capital W-O, capital O and capital W, were redeployed to sell real estate. New subdivisions had names in Spanish, enchanted, you know. You could imagine, you know, a flamenco dancer with castanets, selling you the subdivision. The old Western was selling the new Western landscape. And, once again, obscuring the class divisions in the West. Ultimately, the West that I'm describing here is capitalism, American capitalism at its most extreme. It's the Western version of the 199. It's the devastation of drugs and the drug war. It's the devastation of our immigration policies and migrants trudging through waterless deserts and dying in them, even as they're pursued by Mexican Americans who happen to have a Border Patrol uniform on, or indeed Native Americans. One of the chapters in the book looks at Arizona, southern Arizona, the Tohono O'odham Reservation, and which has become the locus of immigration battles in the area. And you have Native American trackers working for the Border Patrol, tracking Native Americans from Guatemala, don't even speak Spanish, speak their native millenary tongue, encountering Native Americans on this side of the border, on that desert landscape. So, desert of American capitalism, the desert of the boom that we ultimately, the boom was a bust even when it was at its peak, is I think one of the arguments in the book. And as you can tell by the chapter that I just read, I'm arguing also, what do we do with our neighbors? It's kind of like the question that comes up again and again in the book. If the house is on fire next door, aren't we called upon to do something? Isn't like the most basic ethical calculation there obvious? Angela and I talked a lot about what to do with our neighbors during the 3 years that we lived there. There was a child involved. Should we have called Child Protective Services? Reported them? Should we have just called the cops and said, hey, they're dealing? Should we have opened our door to Rose when she was crying, screaming in the courtyard? Rose, want to come over here and tell us what's going on? Ultimately, we didn't do any of those things. We just watched. And the guilt of having just watched, I think, will follow me forever. So, thank you very much for coming here tonight and listening to me ramble on about the desert. If there's any questions or comments about